and sexual orientation for the past 10 years or so. And I'm really passionate about bringing accurate sex science, accurate information to the general public, because very often what gets shared out there in the media by various journalists and outlets is not really accurate, and that bothers me a lot. So I try as much as I can to share. This is going to be a little annoying at the beginning with all the people being late, but hopefully not for too long. So one of the things that we've been working on and started working on and will continue this year with Kenneth is the Smarter Sex Project, which is an 8-part series that kind of combines all the knowledge that we have from research about human sexuality with Kenneth's kind of ability to make that practical and make that applied to people's lives to to help you figure out how to have better, smarter, more informed sex and sex lives and make decisions about sexuality that are the right fit for you. We already did the first part, the authenticity, and then the second part is on consent and hell yes sex, on how to do consent, how to make it sexy, some of both the science around it and the practical stuff around that. That's coming up. When's that, Kenneth? Do you know? Remember? February something, yes, it'll be in February. And then we have the Casual Sex Project that we've been running, where people post their true stories of hookups. We have lots of them, over 3,000 at this point. So if you haven't checked them out, go and perv on other people's hookups, or share yours if you have any to share. And what I'm really excited about right now is that we just finished coding the first batch of 1,000 stories that were submitted to the project, and we're going to start analyzing them and hopefully actually publish from the project something in the academic literature, so it's not just for people to read and write, but also we're going to learn some lessons from it. So that's in the works. Okay. So yeah, working on things that can help figure out your own sexuality. And today's event is sort of part of that whole attempt and effort to make that happen, on talking specifically about squirting, right? I love this image of squirting. There are just it's so interesting to people. It has been so talked about, and there's so many misconceptions. There's so many open questions. There's so many kind of mysteries around this thing, this phenomenon of female ejaculation or squirting. And we thought that it would be a good idea to maybe have me, the scientist, sit down and read all the studies that have been published on this, and then share that with all of you, and then have Kenneth kind of do a little bit of the practical stuff of the how-to and share some of his experiences as a squirt master. Can I call you that? No? Like, no. As a squirt student. Because he has gotten a bit of a reputation as someone who is pretty good at getting that thing out. So we're going to do that. I spent so much time reading research about squirting. My head literally was going to explode last night. I was like, I can't take it anymore. It's going to explode just like that. With brain cells instead of fluid, whatever it may be in that fluid. And we will delve into that, what's in that fluid. But so I hope it's impossible to kind of talk about the sort of the nitty-gritty and what really is squirting and where it comes from without some of the anatomy behind it, some of the little bit of biology and biochemistry around it. And so I really hope you like a little bit of the cerebral stuff before we get to the, okay, so how do you really do it? Which I'm sure people are going to enjoy. But yes, that's what I'm going to tell you about. Oh, this is our wonderful sponsor, Lelo. And by the way, if you're not one of the lucky ones who gets this awesome smart one, you can always go to lelo.com and get any Lelo products with 20% off with my discount code DRZHANA, Dr. Jana. Speaking of Dr. Jana, if you want to take photos of me and of Kenneth on stage, there's no stage, but up here, and post that and share that, you can do that. All my handles are Dr. Jana, DRZHANA, and yeah, let the world know how amazing this was, hopefully. if I don't bore you to death with some of the research around squirting. Okay, so here's what I want to do, or what we're going to do for tonight. I'm going to talk a little bit about some of these things that have been sort of published and talked about in the academic literature. So a little bit history, the prevalence, some perceived experience of female ejaculation or squirting for people, and the big question for a lot of people, and a lot of the conversations around the squirting that are happening in the popular press: what's in the squirt, what's in the ejaculate, and where the hell does it come from? And then try to answer some of the FAQs. You know, some of you who were here earlier, you know, we've asked some of the questions, and those are the ones that come up all the time. So, is squirting pee? Can all women squirt? Is squirting always an orgasm? Is the squirting orgasm a better orgasm than the non-squirting orgasm? And maybe some other questions. And then Kenneth's going to go on to like, okay, so how do you do it? What are some practical tips and skills around that? One caveat is I'm not going to be able to answer all of those FAQs with scientific data as of now, because there's just not enough data. There are a number of questions that people are dying to know the answers to that have not been asked in any kind of significant way in a large sample of people at all, and some of them have not been asked almost ever. So there are still a lot of open-ended questions out there. How does that sound? Good? All right, let's try this. So, female ejaculation, and I'm going to call it female ejaculation. I apologize for the heteronormativity and the cisgender activity. No, that's not a word. Of that term, because not all people who have the anatomy to ejaculate in this way identify as women. So it's but it's been called female ejaculation or squirting. So we're going to go with that, while acknowledging that there's some inconsistencies between sex and gender in this regard. So it's not just the fascination of the Western world. Apparently, there was a study sort of published in 2010 that kind of tried to trace all references in ancient literature to female ejaculation, and they found a bunch of them in ancient China. In Taoist texts from the 4th century on, they talk about, and of course the way they talk about these things is very, very different. It's pretty hilarious from today's standpoint. I want to read you one of them. Her jade gate, you can imagine what the jade gate is, becomes moist and slippery. Then the man should plunge into her very deeply. Finally, copious emissions from her inner heart begin to exude outward. So very poetic, yeah. So often these are poems that people kind of intertwine some eroticism and sexuality into. Also, ancient India, from poems again from the 7th to the 16th century, including some potential mentions of the Kama Sutra and some other similar writings. And then also in the ancient Western world, it was mentioned by people like Aristotle and Galen, who was the foremost doctor of that time in some way, shape, or form. And then de Graaf, actually in the 16th century, described female ejaculation in the Western medical literature. He was a doctor and talked about these glands that are going to later be called Skene's glands, which we'll get to, and talked about the Skene's gland being potentially the female prostate and actually having a role to play in female pleasure and ejaculation, independent of reproduction, which is kind of cool because a lot of the time, female sexual functioning was only described in the context of reproduction and not in the context of pleasure. So that was kind of cool. Pornographic Victorian novels. The Victorian era was, on the face, it was very, very conservative, but there was a lot of kind of sexuality going on in the background. So in their porn novels, they often mentioned apparently female ejaculation. And then what many people are probably familiar with is in 1950, Grafenberg was a doctor who reported on, the role of the urethra in female orgasm, and he was the first one, again, I guess for a second time, and then kind of forgotten for a little bit, that described this and linked expulsion of fluid to stimulation of the interior vaginal wall, which is often now thought of as the G-spot, and where, the spot where you can most consistently elicit this type of female ejaculate. And then also Masters and Johnson apparently noticed a few ejaculators in their many studies. They observed a lot of people they did surveys of people, but they also brought a lot of people into their lab, and they had them masturbate. They masturbated them with vibrators. They had them have sex with people, sometimes even with strangers. There were no institutional review boards at the time, no ethic boards committees, so they could do that kind of stuff. You could never do that. I mean, literally, they would have people come into the lab, and they will randomly assign them to have sex with somebody else who, showed up for the study. Like, you could never do that shit now. For better or worse. But Masters and Johnson apparently were sort of anti-female ejaculation, and they totally discarded these people as errors, and because they were really focused on the clitoral orgasm and kind of trying to prove that, women, because that was the time of Freud still having a lot of influence, that, only the internal orgasm was the right orgasm, the mature orgasm, and women who were coming from clitoral stimulation were somehow immature. And so Masters and Johnson were really trying to prove him wrong. So, so that's a little bit of the history of that. Any surprises? You're like, what the hell? Yeah. Yeah, there were times when people noticed stuff and wrote about that. Okay, so what do we know? Okay, from all this research about it. So one of the questions is, how frequent is it, or how prevalent is it? How many women can have this kind of experience? And sadly, we don't have very good data on this. It drives me nuts, but there have been a couple of studies only, and because there's so few, I'm actually going to tell you about the individual studies. So, in the early 80s, Masters and his collaborators surveyed 300 women and found that only 5% of them said that they experienced an expulsion of fluid at the moment of orgasm. So only 5%. But then more recently, a little bit more recently, not too recent, but these are the most recent studies that exist, I promise you. So in come back. In 84, no, why is it doing that? In 84, Bellow et al., they just looked for women, straight and lesbian women, because they thought lesbians might be more likely to have, to ejaculate. So they made sure they found equal numbers, or more or less equal numbers, of lesbian and straight women, and got 230 of them, and asked them questions about squirting. And they found that in that sample, 54% had experienced ejaculation, defined as orgasmic expulsion of fluid. Then later, a little bit later, a second study with more women, about 1,200 women who were in the professional health world, so they were nurses and counselors and sex educators and sex therapists, were surveyed about the same thing, and about 40% of them said that they had experienced this at least once. What do you think about these numbers? High, low, about right? 40 to 50%, 55%? Is that right? Yeah, you are so correct. It's very vague, right? It could be anything. It could be a little bit of something that comes out. It could be a lot of something that comes out. So yes, it is very, very vague. But these are literally the best data that exist out there. It's mind-blowing that no one has done something more recent and more specific in their definitions, right? We've had nationally representative samples and studies on sexuality-related topics, and nothing has been published. Maybe they've asked the question, but nothing has been published yet. So do you think lesbians were more likely to ejaculate? Who says yes? Who says no? In this study, they were. Yeah, they were. 67% of the lesbians versus 55% of the straight identified women had this experience, apparently. Women may know how to please women. Yeah, what's another explanation potentially? Toys, they may be more likely to be using toys, especially at that time. This is 84. This was collected in 81, 82. I was just being born. Yeah. Right. More familiar how the body works. Yeah, just in general. They've already broken, especially at that time, they've broken a massive, right, social norm around sexuality, just becoming out as lesbian. So they might be more willing to kind of explore other aspects of their sexuality. Yeah. Who knows if this would replicate in a representative sample? Who knows if this would replicate today? That's just what they found. Again, these are not representative samples by any means. So I don't think we can. And then there's the question of the very vagueness of the definition. So at this point, like I don't know how much you can take away from these numbers. It could be somewhere around the 50%. It could be as low as 5%. It could be, as high as 80%. Who knows? I don't think we just know from these data. When the women were asked what the squirt looked like, this is some of the responses. So in one study of ejaculators, they described the fluid as looking like watered-down, fat-free milk, tasting sweet, not smelling like urine, and about a teaspoon in volume. In another one, and we'll talk more about that one a little bit later, where Jillian, she got 13 regular ejaculators, so women who pretty consistently ejaculated, a fair amount, and she talked to them or she asked them a lot of open-ended questions around their ejaculatory experiences, and one of them was, what does it look like? And a lot of them said that it kind of, like, it's so much in quantity that I can't imagine it not coming from the bladder, so I think of it as urine, but it doesn't smell like urine, it doesn't taste like urine, it doesn't look like urine, so I think it's like special kind of urine. A lot of them kind of had that explanation around what their squirt was, and they had kind of accepted it as such, although they still felt that it was this mysterious thing. They weren't sure where it was coming from. And a few of these studies had asked, the women, so where do you think it comes from? And there's just no consensus at all. Most of them say, I have no idea. Some, come up with, it comes from the urethra, or it comes from the vagina, or it comes from, the Skene's glands, or it comes from, who knows where. So there's a lot of diversity in where the women themselves think it's coming from. A recent study in 2013 that got squirters, just squirters, that not necessarily regular ones. They could have been, as long as it's happened once, they were eligible to participate in the study. And this was an international sample. They just put it out there on the internet, and as many women took it. Most were from the U.S. and Germany, but there were women from all over, so 320 of them. And for the color, they said, 80% said that it was clear as water, 20% said it was milky white, and then 1% said it was yellow. So that can kind of maybe get a little bit at the, what's the chemical composition of this, or how it's different. One of the next questions is, what kind of stimulation brings it on? So what would you think? What kind of stimulation brings on the ejaculation? G-spot, which would be what? What kind of actual stimulation? So anterior or front vaginal wall, you kind of hitting the G-spot, Okay. Anything else? The come hither motion, so again, the anterior wall, right? The clitoris. So again, there is no consensus among the women on this topic. And the studies, the different studies finding very different things. So I'll show you, there are 4 studies that have asked, the women themselves, okay, what kind of stimulations do you need for the ejaculate to come out? And this is what they found. So let's go with the first one. That's the lesbian and straight women one, the 231. So this is what you want to be looking at right here. They asked them, what kind of stimulation is required. So 35% of them, of the ones who had experienced ejaculation, said that they needed internal vaginal stimulation. 35%. 19% said external clitoral stimulation without any kind of internal stimulation. Most of them, 72%, said both clitoral and vaginal. And then there was 6% who said other stimulation, like nothing that had to do with the genitals. They could somehow squirt by having other areas of their bodies stimulated. Lucky them. Or, well, it depends on how you look at it. But so that was that study. Then the more recent one with 330 sort of international women squirters, 52% of them said these are not mutually exclusive, so 50% said, I need clitoral, 50% said vaginal, 6% said spontaneous, sort of kind of out of nowhere. Some said it happens in their sleep. But this one, unfortunately, doesn't tell you if it's only. So it could be, some of these are just clitoral, some of these are just vaginal, and some of these are both. So it doesn't, the way they presented the results, it wasn't very clear. But these two, the next two, smaller samples are kind of interesting. So Jill and the one with the 13 sort of regular squirters, almost all of them, all but 2, said that it was just clitoral stimulation, not vaginal at all. And then 2 said vaginal stimulation only, and then most of them said, but both is usually, what gets it to happen. It was the exact opposite in this other small study, which we're going to talk about in a lot more detail in a bit, where basically all but 1, it was a very small sample, seven people, said it was only the digital stimulation of the interior wall of the vagina, the come hither motion of the G-spot, the sort of the standard type of stimulation that we associate with squirting. How does that sound? Is that sounds reasonable that people have different ways to do that? Give me some water. Lauren, thank you. And always the same? Always like one type or the other? No, one right, but you might have people who are more consistent, right? So there are some people who are no, it's only, the digital stimulation of the interior wall, and there are some people, no, it's only the clit, and then you have some people who are, it could be both or a combination. Mm-hmm. So if something comes out, then it does qualify as expulsion of fluid, right, at or around orgasm. We often think of the squirt as this, Olympic style, porn kind of. It has to go 2 meters, and come in a gallon of fluid. No, very often what comes out is, a lot less in quantity and also a lot less in force. So it could just dribble out a little bit, or, yeah. So all of that would qualify, under these definitions as squirt or ejaculate. Yeah. Other questions? Okay. Oh. I should do this research. Yeah. But the way to do this research would be to get a nationally representative sample of people. Without that, to get at these percentages, like how much do you do that or how often do you do that, to get at these percentages, you really need a nationally representative sample. Without that, those those percentages mean nothing. It's different when we're going to transition into talking about what the hell is in the squirt. Like, you're never going to get a nationally representative sample of women for that one, and you don't need a nationally representative sample of women for that one. You can glean insights from smaller and a non-representative sample. But if you want the percentages, you need a nationally representative sample of women. And that costs money and all that. So that would be a big project. But yeah.
I don't know how well it might work in a study of orgasm on the lack of it. It's not such a setting.
That's true, but all of the studies, well, not all, but many of the studies that I'm just going to tell you about now, that's exactly what they've done. They've gotten women, put them on a table in a lab, and then either had them stimulate themselves to a squirting orgasm, or had their partners stimulate them to a squirting orgasm, or the researchers themselves did it, or had like a vibrator do that, the researchers did it with their hands or with the vibrator or something like that. Yeah, it's pretty crazy. It's a good. I'm not sure how bed-like the situations are, and not all studies have provided all the information to kind of really get a sense of what this environment looked like. Some do say it's a fully equipped sleep lab, and the sleep labs would usually look like a bedroom with a bed and. Medical kink is real, yes. That's true. Maybe these women had a kink. There's actually a study that I just read of asphyxiation, suffocating, and female ejaculation. There was this Czech, I think, scientist who was arguing that very often women who enjoy asphyxiation, they are also ejaculating when coming from that or something. So, kink might go more with that. I don't know. Okay, so, yes? Are they factoring Kegel? So a lot of these studies will ask about things like, urinary continence and strength of the PC muscles, and some have looked at whether ejaculators and non-ejaculators have differences in their PC muscle strength and uterine muscle strength. What do you think? Yeah? Who would have stronger PC muscles? Yeah, so the ejaculators have stronger PC muscles and stronger uterine muscle contractions, apparently, at least from the studies available. Yeah, that should, whether pregnancy, whether women are, have given birth to a child or not, should potentially or could potentially have an impact on that. And some studies have excluded women who've given birth. Some studies have included just anyone. This is often hard to find women to participate in these kinds of studies. I mean, it's really not that easy to get them to do that. Often, you have to come back a couple of times, give a couple of samples, and, and I'll explain one of the studies that was pretty damn intrusive in what they asked these women to kind of go through in order to get the samples the way they wanted to get the samples. So, very often it'll be like, okay, just whoever is available will take it, right? And you'll see that in the number of people who are often in these studies. So yeah, when you have surveys, you can get hundreds or thousands of people to participate, but when you want people to give you, squirt samples, you don't get that many people. I was thinking about this. I was like, oh my God, I know people in my community who could totally do that, but there's no one these days nearby doing that. Actually, one of the people who first started this whole G-spot thing, Beverly Whipple, she was at she still is, Rutgers, but I don't know if she's still doing this research. So if you are a squirter and you want to contribute to science, you could email some of these people, though many of them are in like Mexico and Europe and other parts of the US, but Okay, so let's talk about a little bit about the more sort of biological nitty-gritty of what is this thing and where it comes from. And in order to do that, we have to do just a little bit of reproductive genital anatomy and pleasure anatomy, because I want to make sure that everybody's on the same page. I know that some people know a lot about this already. Some people don't know that much about. So I just want to make sure that we have all the sort of organs and parts of the body down. So external, because we're going to talk about some of them. So external structures that we see, the vulva, right, which often is wrongly called the vagina. It really isn't the vagina, right? All of this is the vulva. So we have the mons pubis, the bone, then we have the labia majora, or the outer lips, and we have the inner lips right there, and then we have that crown jewel that serves no other purpose but give people pleasure, which is pretty amazing, the only organ in the body that does that. And I'll show you a little more about the clitoris, but so that's what's that? Which part of the clitoris is that? The glands, the head, right? So the clitoris is built very similar to a penis, just smaller and shorter, but it has all the parts. Oh, you can show it. I don't have a hand to show it, but we have a vulva puppet, which was created by Dory Lane, the sort of the original idea, but then it was made. Yeah, no, I know, but it was upgraded, 2.0 by Jennifer over there. Thank you for doing that, because it's pretty awesome. Yeah, so we have the clitoris right there, and then the urethral opening, right? The urethra where pee comes out of is right sort of below the clitoris and above the vaginal opening. And we're there we go. Represented by Sparkle in Jen's version of the vulva puppet. Okay. Right? We're good on this? Okay. And then there will be some stuff that we're going to talk about later, some glands and stuff that kind of come out here, next to the urethra or somewhere else in the vestibule that can play a role in female ejaculation. Okay. What's inside? So, wait, we're not at the clitoris yet. Hide it. Too soon. The next one we're going to talk about the clitoris. So, let's see what we have here. So it's a side view, and we have the vagina right here, the vaginal opening, the vagina going all the way up, the cervix here, the beginning of the uterus, and then the uterus, right? So that's one part of things. Then we have the urethra and the bladder here. You have like kind of serving as the flight attendant. And the rectum and the anus and all that back there, all the good stuff for those who like that sort of stuff. And then we have the clitoris, which here you can see more of, right? So that's the glands that you can see from the outside, and then there's a bunch of it inside that you don't see, that most people don't know it exists, which is really, really sad, but it does, and that's where that comes from, because that's all of the clitoris. The hood. Right, so the clitoris has external and internal parts. The external part is a little bit that we can see, the tip of the iceberg, quite literally in this case. Then we have the shaft, which is kind of, like the shaft of the penis. And then it has all of this erectile tissue that is inside the crura, or the legs, and the vestibular bulbs that kind of go around. What are these things? Like going like this, we have the urethra, right? And then the vagina. So it literally, the internal portion of the clitoris goes, like you have the urethra and the vagina underneath, and then the clitoris kind of goes around, right? Goes around that distal the closer to the outside portion of both the urethra and the vagina. And that all will become sort of relevant when we talk when we're talking about ejaculation. A better way to see this three-dimensionally is this awesome 3D sonograph of the clit, which I love. So, right, this is the bladder and the urethra, this is the vagina and the uterus, and this is the clit that goes around it. So you can see it, right, encircling the, both the urethra and the vagina. Sorry. How many people knew about this already? Okay, we have a bunch who didn't know. Yes. Isn't this awesome? Any questions about the anatomy stuff around this? Yeah.
Know anything about why there's the two sort of structures? That I knew it went around, but I had no idea that it's like this duo kind of.
So these things, the crura, they attach to the bone.
Oh, it's just the bone effect.
Yeah, they're sort of, I mean, they kind of come, out and attach to the bone. And all of this, all of the yellow stuff is, right, goes back there. All of the yellow stuff is erectile tissue. So it fills up with blood when, the owner gets aroused, and it, it swells up.
You can really feel it if you pay attention how much bigger that.
And it depends. In some people with clitoris, it might get a lot bigger, and some might not. But yeah, and so it engorges, it swells up.
Some people have longer shaft. Some people have longer shaft, and some people is much more shallow. So
Yeah, and sometimes it'll be all the way hidden under the prepuce, under the foreskin, and sometimes it'll come out. Different points in the arousal process, it might come out or hide underneath even further. So it, there's a wide variety of versions that people with clitorises come in.
That's essentially the reason why the labia also, the labia minora gets engorged.
Yeah, I mean, there's obviously a lot of blood vessels there too, and so the labia will also get engorged. Yeah, absolutely. Say it again?
It's not it's the clitoral tissue that raises it. You're saying it's both of them.
Yeah, I mean, all of that will to some extent fill up with blood. Yeah, but this is specifically erectile tissue. The labia minora and the majora, they're not made of erectile tissue. The same kind of tissue as the penis is, right? So they will, to some extent, there will be more blood flowing through. There'll be more blood flowing to the vaginal walls as well, which are not erectile tissue, right? But but the clitoris in particular will swell up and get erect. Any other questions around this? Yeah.
You're talking about the study. You seem to be implying that most women can't tell where the squirting is coming from. But do they know that it's not coming from the urethra? The urinary tract, do they know it's not coming from there?
The women or?
The women.
No, some think it's coming from the urethra, and some don't know. So it depends. Some think it's not coming from the urethra. Some think it's coming from the vagina. So there's a sort of a wide variety of answers that women give as to where their own squirt is coming from. I'm about to go into that. Well, sure, you would need a representative sample, but where is it coming from? And so this is where, you can't quite trust the women because they might really not know. Some have not examined it very well. And even scientists who do this, who know all the anatomical parts or think they know all the anatomical parts, because we clearly don't know yet all that's happening down there. But even they often, some of these studies, they'll be like staring at it while it's happening, and they have cameras pointed at the vulva, and then they're watching the video afterwards, trying to figure out where it's going. Even they sometimes don't know what's happening, right? So it's not surprising that the women themselves will be confused very often about what's going on. Okay, so what's going on? This is what we know. So in 2013, there was a review paper of all the previous research on this topic published in the Journal of Sexual Medicine, which is one of the leading sexual kind of medicine journals and just sexuality journals. And they looked for everything published from 1948 in the academic literature to 2012, and they found 46 different studies that mentioned in some way, shape, or form female ejaculation, female prostate squirting, or also coital incontinence, because they were trying to, one of the things that they wanted to do is to see if they can distinguish between squirting and female ejaculation and incontinence, urinary incontinence, right? Because that's often, and has been thought that whenever women are expelling like a lot of fluid, like the whole gushing fluid that you see in porn, that must be related to incontinence, which is a pretty frequent issue for a lot of women. Some estimated, 20 to 40% of women suffer from some form of urinary incontinence at some point in their lives, which is a really high number, right? So, that was kind of the thinking that this whole squirting thing may just be incontinence. And so not all of these studies, looked specifically at female ejaculation. Some looked more about, at incontinence. And they found 8 peer-reviewed studies that specifically tested the chemical composition, and also some of them try to figure out, okay, exactly where is this coming from. Not all of them did that, but some did try to make that distinction. And because it's only 8, I'm just going to tell you about all of them. And these are all the studies that they had. Exactly. So here's a sample size. This is in chronological order, so from the oldest one published, which was in the beginning of the 80s, all the way to 2011 or 2010, the last one was published. And this is the sample size. So we have 1, then we have 11, and it's actually not 11, it's only 6. The study was also looking at finding the G-spot, and they had 11 people for finding the G-spot part, and only 6 people for the ejaculation part, so it's only 6 people in that one. I tracked them all down, except one, because it was a paper presented at a conference, so I couldn't track it down. Then 7, 5, 27, which I crossed because they weren't trying to test the chemical composition. What they were trying to do, and it's fascinating, is to see if they can get women to squirt. So they, so what they did, and I'll tell you about them before we talk about the rest, but they had women who came into the clinic for fertility issues, and they told them, look, we want to figure out if all women can squirt. And, would you like to do this? We'll, put you on a table, and then one of us will try to make you squirt using the standard procedure: 2 fingers, anterior vaginal wall, digital stimulation. And they got 27 women to say, sure. It wasn't Kenneth, no, it was in Czechoslovakia, I think. When Czechoslovakia still existed, and some of the time it was male doctors, some were female doctors, and actually they tried to get women to squirt 4 times in 4 different sessions. And so what they were looking at was, can we get this to happen? And what they did was, or what they found was that after 4 times of trying really, really hard, sometimes up to an hour, was that 37% of the women could squirt. They did not get 63% of them to do that. And these were not squirters. Some of them had squirted before, some of them had not. It was just sort of a sample of women who said, yeah, sure, go ahead and try to do that. And then of the 37 that they did manage to get to squirt, they divided them into easy to squirt, hard to squirt, and then sort of an intermediate one. So yeah, the easy ones were after a minute or 2, stuff started coming out. The hard ones were, I think, like 15 or more minutes, and then the intermediate were somewhere kind of in between that. Is there anything else about that study that was interesting? I don't know. If I think of that, I'll tell you. Yeah. Because it didn't actually test the chemical composition. Yeah.
So there seems to be a correlation between quantity and composition.
Oh, wait, hold on. We haven't gotten there. Hold on. Okay, so then we have this one. This is the only one I couldn't track down because it was a paper presented at a conference. So, 26 ejaculation samples. I have no idea what happened there. And then 7, 2, and 1. So those are the samples that we have on record in the published literature of, people, scientists collecting squirt, and then in all of these cases comparing it to the urine samples of the exact same woman, right? And sometimes multiple samples. They'll sometimes collect urine just before sexual stimulation, then the woman squirts, then you get another sample of urine right after that or something like that on several occasions. And then they do biochemical analysis. And here's what they found. In that first one, the one woman that they found back in 81, they found that the squirt had higher levels of glucose, PAP, which is a prostate, it's not the prostate-specific antigen, that's PSA, and other studies more recently have tested that, but it's a prostate, again, prostate indicative phosphatase or something like that. And they found lower urea and creatinine, which are sort of typical of healthy urine. So in this one person, they concluded that, yes, the female ejaculate was very significantly different from the urine that that woman provided. The next study, which had 11 women, and actually was comprised of many of the same people, the same team as the previous study, as in the next study, they did not find a difference. So they found that glucose, creatinine, the PAP, which they then renamed tartrate and inhibitory acid phosphatase, I don't know, whatever. I'm not a medical doctor, so some of these things are kind of over my head too. But that's something that should be in the and exists in the male prostate and the male prostate fluid, but it should not exist in high concentrations in urine. And so they found that there was no difference. The ejaculate was similar to urine in its biochemical composition. And there was no increased levels of this prostate-specific stuff. So there you go. That was in 80-something. And it's kind of circled because in all of these 8 studies, that's the only one that found no differences. All the other ones found that there was a significant difference between the ejaculate and the urine of the women. So then, you have these 7 women who found, different levels that the, prostate-specific stuff was.
Actually, the very last one, actually had two different samples.
I'll get to the last one. The last one is really interesting. But, yeah, so, lower levels, again, so it usually was found lower levels of urea and creatinine, and then higher levels of the prostate-specific antigen or this phosphatase, which is another prostate-specific thing. So this next one found that. And what was interesting, so most of these, yeah. Yes, that's what I'm saying. So the thinking is that, this is coming from the female prostate, from these glands that are kind of similar histologically, in terms of the tissue, to the male prostate. And I will get to that and what that might be and what that might do in just a second. But yes, and that has been one way to distinguish it from urine, because urine shouldn't have, or if it does, should have very small percentage of small levels of that prostate-specific, chemicals. Okay. So this. I'm actually confused by this because they concluded that it was different. I'm not sure why they did this, but so PSA may have been similar, but other things weren't similar. And then they also looked at sort of ultrasounds and thought that they found a female prostate. So, most of these studies found some sort of a difference between the ejaculate and the urine, except the Goldberg study back in the 80s. And then, very recently, in 2011, this, one group of scientists in, I think, Italy said, wait a second, I think we're talking about two separate things. Because some of these you'll see, thin, milky, watery fluid all the way to yellow color fluid, and some of them were in between, like, no color, whitish, translucent with whitish particles, milky white, mucus-like emissions, and then some of the women were reporting kind of no color, and so these guys were like, okay. We think it's, yeah. Yes, that's a great question, and I'll get to it. I'll answer that. I can answer. Yes. So that's a separate thing. So vaginal lubrication is yet another thing, another type of fluid. Anyone knows what that is? Unless you were in my human sexuality class, which then I expect you to know. Sorry. Anyone know what that is? What's lubrication? Where the fuck does lubrication come from? Copper's gland in men for the pre-cum. No? Okay, fine, my students. Bartholin's gland is the equivalent to the Cowper's gland, yeah, so there's some sort of pre-ejaculate that comes out of there, and also the scent often comes from the Bartholin's glands, which are one of those glands that exist on that vestibule, right, kind of next to or below or above the vaginal opening. But most of it does not come from the Bartholin's glands, actually. Most of it is what's called transudate, damn it. It's all the blood rushing in to the vaginal walls creates plasma. And the plasma seeps out through the cells. And that's what vaginal lubrication is. It's plasma. Yeah, blood plasma. Transudate. I think I'm not sure I'm pronouncing it correctly. Yes. Oh, yeah, sure. It can smell different. It can have different, over the course of the cycle, it absolutely can change. And there's also cervical secretions that contribute to that as well. So, women will secrete stuff even when they're not sexually aroused, right? And that's the stuff that comes out of the cervix. And that will change as hormones change across the cycle. And it can also change, how it tastes and smells and all that will change depending on diet, depending on level of hydration, depending on, other things like sleep, I think, and, other kind of lifestyle factors. It's common issues that women will come to sex therapists for, saying, it hurts to have sex. And then sex therapist says, have you tried lube? And they say, oh, no, I have not. Here, try lube and then come back if you still have the issue. And the number of people who do not come back because that was the issue is mind-blowing. That's what all my sex therapist friends say. Yes, birth control can cause changes, absolutely, vaginal dryness and other changes. Birth control can, yeah. So it's the hormonal changes that happen that, will affect. They will affect different women differently, though. Right, so not everybody's going to have the same reaction. It also depends on what kinds of hormones and what level of hormones and all that. Okay, so these new guys on the scene, they were like, okay, we think it's, so everybody who was trying to argue that this ejaculate thing is different from urine, which was most of the people who've been doing this research. They've really tried to be like, no, we hear from women that they're doing this, that it kind of, smells different and tastes different and looks different, so it has to be something different, so we want to prove that it's different. And they've been saying the entire time it's the female prostate. It's the female prostate that is creating this, and I'll go a little more into what the female prostate may be. But then these guys were like, not so sure that it's all female prostate. We think it's two different things. And so they found a woman who said that she ejaculated two different things. They found one woman. And they got her to, I forget exactly what they did in that case, how she stimulated herself or her partner stimulated her or something. And they got two different types of ejaculate. One that came from the urethra. And so that's the squirt. They called it differently. So the squirting, which was thin, watery liquid, almost no color or smell. And it was a lot, 120 mil, which is, what is that, a couple of ounces, maybe 2.5 ounces of fluid. And then kind of next to the urethra, from these Skene's glands, these ducts that also come out very kind of close to the Bartholin's glands on the vestibule, they saw this white milky substance coming out, a lot less, 1 milliliter of that. And they collected them differently. You kind of have to collect the big squirt in receptacles and bags and stuff. And then this one, they just drew it with a syringe. Well, it gets so much worse in the next study. So, and they analyzed all of that, and they analyzed the urine, samples that this woman provided, and it was very, very different. So what they found was that what they call the ejaculate, the white milky substance, that had very high concentrations of PSA, of prostate-specific antigen, and pretty low levels of these other things that are in urine. So urea, uric acid, creatinine, very little of that, but very high levels of PSA. The squirt, the thin, watery substance, had very little PSA and had significant amounts of urea, uric acid, and creatinine, although not nearly as high as in her urine sample that she had provided right before. And so, based on all of this evidence, and they kind of provided images in the paper that you can see. So this is the squirt right away, 2 hours after collection. This is the squirt and the urine. Compared, so that's the same squirt with the morning urine. So you can compare the color, right? Very different, obviously different color. And then this was the milky white ejaculate that came out of supposedly the Skene's glands with some microscopic kind of aspects of it. Interestingly, they looked at the microscopic stuff to see what kind of bacteria and cells would be in the milky substance. And they found bacteria that would be expected if it's coming, from the body, but the different kinds of bacteria than the ones that live in the vagina. So the conclusion was that, wherever this came from, it did not come in contact with the vaginal environment. It was sort of, the vaginal environment, very specifically, right? It certainly came from that whole area, but not from the vagina. Okay, so based on all of this, right, based on all of these studies that Pastor et al. Reviewed, they kind of came up with this diagram of all the shit that comes out of women when they orgasm, or that could potentially come out, right? So, let me go through them. So there was a question about vaginal lubrication, right? So there is vaginal lubrication, and that comes out of the vagina. And that is, the vaginal fluid discharge that we see that can be a lot or can be a little, depending on, the age of the woman, the type of the woman, what she eats, how much she's hydrated, what kinds of medicine or birth control she might be on, like a whole, is she premenopausal, postmenopausal, right? And that, the plasma, right? And then sometimes the stuff that can kind of get a little squirted may be strong contractions. Some women have very strong vaginal contractions. So, and if there's a lot of liquid, if there, a lot of vaginal lubrication, some of that get kind of squirted in a squirting sort of manner, and get thought of like as some sort of an ejaculate. But and that was one of the theories of what the ejaculate was. But that's not what we're talking about. But it is possible that's what the vaginal fluid expulsions refer to. So sometimes that might be the case. The incontinence stuff, I already addressed it a little bit, but so that we can kind of then distinguish it from the ejaculation orgasm. Right, as I said, a lot of women suffer from urinary incontinence of some type, and there's usually two types. The stress urinary incontinence, when you cough or when you sneeze or when you do something really, physically exertive, a little bit of urine can leak out. Right? That's one type. A lot of women have that issue. And then the other one is this detrusor overactivity, which the detrusor is that muscle that is in the bladder that is usually relaxed and allows urine to collect, and then when it's time to pee, it contracts, and that's what gets the urine out of the bladder into the urethra and then out of the body. And so the urinary incontinence that has to do with just an overactive detrusor, an overactive muscle that gets squeezed more than it's necessary. So the symptoms for that are women who kind of feel like they have to pee all the time. It kind of bothers them. They might go to the bathroom and only a few drops come out. When a urinary tract infection happens, that's sort of the symptoms, like I have to go to the bathroom all the time. So those are, potential. And then, so what happens is in some of these cases, in some of these women who are either detrusor overactive type of incontinence or the stress urinary incontinence, sometimes when penetration happens, right, that's the stressor that gets some of the urine to leak out. And sometimes they might kind of sort of lose maybe control over their detrusor activity during orgasm, and so the urine might leak out. And that is, a fairly common complaint of women who are incontinent, who come to a clinic and say, look, I have all these symptoms, but it's not just that I squirt when I orgasm. I also have all these, other incontinence symptoms, and this is one of those symptoms. So that can be one of the symptoms for women who are incontinent. And then you're left with all these women who are not incontinent, who do not complain of any sort of either stress urinary incontinence or detrusor overactivity type incontinence, who are having some sort of an ejaculation around the orgasm. And so here it is. It seems like there are two different things that we're talking about. The female prostate, which these researchers are now trying to distinguish and give different names to. So we're going to go with that just for simplicity's sake. The female ejaculation, like the real female ejaculation, some of them have actually called it like the real, because it's comparable to the male ejaculation that has the prostate fluid in it that comes from the female prostate. And then they have the squirt, the gushing squirt that comes out of the, that goes through the bladder, that has to go through the bladder. There is no other explanation but that it goes through the bladder. And then that sometimes it's a mixed, both of those things are coming out. And I'll explain both and what the differences are between these. So, female prostate. It's a very confusing organ, let me tell you. And we still have a lot of questions around what the hell this organ is, what it looks like, and what it does, and why it exists in the first place. So, but it seems like it does exist in some women. But not all women have it. So histological analyses, when usually on cadavers, they dissect, they look, and they find it only in about 50 to 65% of women. It seems to be smaller than the male prostate, And interestingly, it seems to be basically embedded in the wall of the urethra, as opposed to the male prostate. Oh, we didn't put a male reproductive thing, but the male prostate kind of goes around the urethra, right? It's larger, right? It's kind of like this, and it goes around the urethra and then drains into the urethra. It has, multiple ducts leading into the urethra, and what it produces the prostate fluid, which makes up what percentage of the semen? Would you say? 99? Do you have any other offers? 70? 80? 30, actually. What percent? So prostate fluid is 30% of the semen, of the stuff that comes out of men or people with penises. Who are not all men. What percentage is the sperm? The stuff that makes babies? 0.05? 1%? It's about 1%. Okay, so what's the rest? We're missing like 59%. Anyone know? Food for the sperm. Yes, food for the sperm. Yeah, Emily. The seminal vesicles. Seminal vesicles make 60% of it, and it's mostly fructose. It's energy. It's carbs for the sperm to be able to swim and get to the egg and do what they were meant to be doing in life. So yeah, that's, in short, what male semen is composed of. And so, about 30% is prostate fluid. And so it's, histologically, this tissue that is found in some women, but not all, looks like the adolescent or teenage, sort of pre-puberty, not adolescent, pre-puberty prostate tissue in men. Yes? No, I'm pretty sure the seminal vesicles will figure out a way to make fructose for, yeah. So can I have some more water? It's a good question. It's almost impossible not to get any carbs, and, I know you. Okay, so more about this weird organ, which we weren't sure that we have it, and we're still not quite sure. There's still, when you read some of these studies, you read also answers by some other scientists saying, no, this does not exist. It's a lie. It's a myth. So it's still happening. But it seems like, from what we know, and again, these are individual studies, not all of them have been replicated and whatnot. It's of varying size and type and location. So in different women, this prostate thing will look different. Sometimes it will be, close to the urethral opening. Sometimes it will be further back. Sometimes it will be rudimentary. Sometimes it will be throughout the entire urethra or urethral wall. Sometimes it'll just look different in different women. And then what's also different, and this might explain some of the differences in the findings of the biochemical composition, is that, so it has lots of these ducts and kind of glandular things. Sometimes it drains directly into the urethra, all these ducts. There's like 20 or 30 ducts potentially. Sometimes they drain directly into the urethra. Sometimes they drain into these Skene's ducts, Skene's glands that come out of the body themselves. So some women have Skene's glands, whatever. It's kind of difficult to know whether it's referring to the Skene's glands, to the prostate, or to the ducts. But some women will have these ducts, right, that come out of the female prostate and out onto the vestibule. So you can see them. Sometimes they could get infected. You can have an abscess on the Skene's gland, or something like that. And then some women will not have them because potentially they drain straight into the urethra. Right? And so whatever they're producing, whatever fluid they're producing, is going to go into the urethra directly, and it's going to come out if it comes out of the urethra. We have no idea what purpose this serves. Some people have said maybe it's just sort of a vestigial thing from the fact that men need a prostate, and because we have. like male nipples kind of thing. Yeah, that they don't really serve any purpose. Some have suggested maybe they have an antimicrobial role. We don't know. We honestly, like at this point, based on everything I read, I wouldn't say that we know. Okay, but so the stuff that comes out of there is not a lot, is a little bit, right? So somewhere between 1 milliliter to 30 to 50 mil at most. So, or 0.3 ounces to 1.7 ounces at maximum. So no cups full of liquid, right, of gushing liquid. And logically thinking, it's impossible, it's physically impossible for this tiny gland that's smaller than the male prostate to create all of this fluid in it somehow, when the prostate fluid is a lot less than the squirt that we're seeing. So most likely it's that milky white substance that comes out, and it's small amounts, that is the real ejaculate, the stuff that has PSA in it and low levels of the urine typical chemicals. Okay, what about the squirt? What about the gushing thing? What about the thing that pretty much everybody is asking about? So it seems like, so this is the exact quote that they concluded from the review: squirting or gushing is the orgasmic transurethral, so through the urethra, expulsion of a larger quantity of diluted, chemically changed urine. So it could be anywhere between 50 mil and 900 mil, and that's almost a liter. What's that in? It's a quart. There you go. It's a lot of liquid, right? It's a lot of liquid. Again, obviously a lot of differences from 50 mil, which is not that much, to almost a liter, which is a lot. And so this is thought to pass through the bladder and then the urethra. So this thing may pass through the urethra or may not pass through the urethra, depending on where it's draining, right? Where these Skene's glands or the female prostate is draining into. Whereas this one most definitely passes through the bladder and the urethra. And it's thought that the detrusor, that muscle that releases, when it contracts, that releases urine, is the one responsible for those kinds of contractions, because there's no other muscle in that area that could potentially create that much force, especially when you see the squirt getting expelled with so much force, as you often see in porn, or if you have personal experience with it. But most definitely is not urinary incontinence in many of these women. So it could potentially be a side effect, or not side effect, but one of the symptoms. However, the studies that have looked at this find that, as I mentioned earlier, that ejaculators have stronger PC muscles and uterine muscle contractions than non-ejaculators. And incontinent women almost exclusively have weak PC muscles. That's the whole point, and very often you treat incontinence by strengthening the PC muscle. And then also, a couple of studies were done where they specifically asked for incontinence symptoms and for incontinence voiding patterns, and these urodynamic studies, which I have to explain what they were. I didn't know what they were. Anyone know what a urodynamic study is? They put a catheter in, and they fill up your bladder with saline to its max. And then they say, don't void, don't pee for as long as you can, while trying to balance on your heels, sneeze and cough, and wash your hands underwater, which kind of makes you want to pee, right? So basically they're trying to see, can you hold it in, right? Are your PC muscles and the detrusor, are they strong enough to actually do what they need to be doing while you're exerting this stress on your bladder? And so they did that with, there was, I think in this study, there were like 20 or 30 women who were ejaculators and non-ejaculators, and then, but not incontinent, and none of them had any incontinence symptoms, either of the stress type, when I cough, when I sneeze, it comes out, or of the, I often have to pee urgently. And so of the detrusor reactivity, and they all had normal voiding patterns. They all had normal urodynamic types. So, it's clearly not that, at least in many of the women who are capable of squirting. So they also provided this very useful, I think, summary of all these different studies and what they found of the differences in these different types of potentially ejaculate. So, and what's in them. So plus means there's a little bit, 2 pluses means, there's an intermediate amount, 3 pluses means there's a lot, and then same with the minuses. So voided urine, squirting, the gushing squirt, and then the ejaculate, the prostate specific stuff. So PSA, very little, there can be, and the PSAP is another prostate specific stuff. So there's a little bit in urine, but not a lot. There is, depending on the study, that's why there's that slash here. There can be more or less, but less so than in the ejaculate. And the ejaculate has a lot of PSA, almost not, but not quite comparable to male semen. Uric acid, urea, and creatinine, all at high levels in urine. Then squirt has less of them, but does have them, and then very little or none in the ejaculate, the milky stuff from the prostate. Then the glucose and the fructose, which is kind of interesting. None of it is in urine, and it shouldn't be unless you're diabetic. A little bit in the squirt, and then there's more of it in the ejaculate, which is actually kind of surprising because the prostate doesn't make fructose. It's the seminal vesicles that make fructose. The prostate, the prostate fluid is other stuff. So they're like, where's this fructose coming from? Like, is maybe the female prostate producing fructose, which would be odd because the male prostate is not producing fructose, and what is it serving? They're saying maybe, women are working for the sperm too. Maybe women are, creating some fructose for the sperm, to go up their reproductive tracts as well. But it's all speculative at this point. It's like, no one knows. And then there's difference in sodium, potassium, and chlorine, the color, which we saw, and then the volume, right? So the squirt is kind of comparable to the volume to urine, and then the ejaculate is only a tiny bit. Okay, questions about this?
So is the squirting distinct? It's not a mixture of the ejaculate and the urine. It's distinct then.
Well, it's distinct here because it's, it has been voided at a different time, right? It has been voided around orgasm. And now most of the studies, right, we saw those 8 studies, all but one found that it had, different composition, that it had less of the urine-specific stuff and more potentially of the PSA stuff. Some of that squirt, because the prostate, if the female prostate may drain directly into the urethra, it may be all mixed. So it might be, in many women, it might be the mixed form coming out. And in some women, if the prostate is not at all draining into the urethra, if it's draining all outside through the ducts, then it might be all just squirt coming from the bladder. But it comes from the bladder, right? It passes through the bladder, comes from the bladder, and then it has some level of the urine-specific stuff. So it's kind of like diluted pee. Now, some of these are saying, and it's chemically changed, and it's unclear what the process of and how it would get chemically changed. So there's some speculations around that, which are just too speculative to even go into.
But it doesn't seem to be essentially chemically changed except for the percentages, but in terms of the substance.
Right, it might just be diluted pee. And depending on when exactly, was the last time the woman peed, how much water she drank, it might be more or less diluted. So, if you squirt, after you haven't peed in a long time, it might be a lot higher concentrations of urine than if you squirt right before, right after you've peed. Yeah. Some of the studies asked about that, and it didn't seem to be correlated, but there's some speculations that there may be, but there's just no data on that. It's a great question, though. Was that your question? Oh. get to it. I promise. Okay, so.
I'm very, very surprised.
I'm not quite done with the research because if you were interested in this, and around a couple of years ago, there was a big study that was, I mean, big study. It was big because all the media picked up on it with things like squirting is just pee, scientists are saying. And there was a lot of hype around this study. And it was published after this review, so I kind of want to tell you about the study because, you know, it was one of the two in this whole body of literature that actually found that it was no different from urine. And so it's pretty sophisticated, and also in the explanation of what exactly they did and how they did it, and because it's a newer study, and you know, newer studies are just better quality in terms of how it's written, and very often, and this was published in a decent journal. So this is what this final study, and this is it. Right now, this is it. This is the last study on this question to have ever been published in the academic literature. So they did 7 participants, and they looked for regular squirters of a glass or more. So specifically, you know, women who said, I regularly squirt a regular glass, 8 ounce or more. This was the procedure, and this is where I just want to like drive this point of how uncomfortable and intrusive some of this can be, right? So they had the women urinate completely. Then they did a ultrasonographic exam number 1 because they wanted to check for normal pelvic anatomy and the fact that the bladder was really empty. They told the women, empty the bladder completely. Don't let any urine left in there. Then they left them in the room and said, go at it. Stimulate yourself. And some women chose to do that by themselves with their hands. Some chose to use a toy of some sort, and some had a partner either digitally or coitally, so have sex with them. They had to use a gloved hand if they were using a hand, and had to use a penis. They had to use a condom if they were using a penis. Then they were like, okay, now when you're stimulated enough, when you feel like you're aroused enough, stop. We're going to come back in, do another ultrasound, because now we want to check if there have been any changes in the pelvic anatomy and the size of the bladder. Is it still empty, right? Or has it filled up because you just peed? They gave them about an hour, I think, of self-stimulation or stimulation, however the women choose to stimulate. Then they're like, okay, we're done with the ultrasound number 2. Now, you know, keep at it until you squirt. And then collect it in so they kept going whatever it is that they were doing, and collect it in plastic bags. Because, you know, we're talking about glasses full of stuff. And they're like, okay, great, you're done. Now we come back in and do another ultrasound. And then you pee again. And here are the results. So first, the bladder results. So I'm not sure how much you can see, but the first ultrasound that was right after the women peed completely, and they were supposed to empty their bladder completely. This is that image of one woman in this case. This is the bladder. There's nothing, right? You're not seeing anything filled up, so it's empty. The bladder is indeed completely empty, and when they measured, it was like 0, 0 in all of them. In all women, the bladder was completely empty. Then, an hour after stimulating themselves or having their partner stimulate, the bladder filled up, even though it was just voided, right, an hour ago, completely full after stimulation, and this was right before squirting. Then they squirted, collected that in a plastic bag, and then the bladder went back to being completely empty. So the conclusion here was, it's the bladder, right? It's obviously, you know, you cleared it of urine, then it filled back in, then you cleared it again when you squirted, and then it's empty again. The second thing they did was a biochemical analysis. And they specifically tested urea, creatinine, uric acid, and PSA, prostate-specific antigen. And these are all the individual participants, the 7 participants. But basically, you know, you can geek out on the individual people, and there are individual differences in that regard. But what they found with the statistical analyses was that there was no difference in urea, there was no difference in creatinine, there's no difference in uric acid between the squirt and the urine right before and the urine right after. There was a difference in the PSA levels of the squirt. The squirt had more prostate-specific antigen than the first urine sample, but not the second urine sample, with some individual differences. So some women had no PSA at all in their squirt. Some had a lot. You know, some actually had more of the urine type stuff, you know, uric acid, urea, than in their urine. So the squirt, like here, had more urea than the first urine. Same here. It was the opposite for some other women. You know, like this one, for example, right? This one was more of the, you know, less urea. So this was more of the sort of what you would want to see if you want to argue that this is completely different or that it's different. That is diluted urine, so you know, higher levels of these things in the initial urine sample, and then lower levels in the squirt, and then high levels of PSA in the squirt, but low levels in the urine samples. Yeah. Who knows? Yeah. They did not control for dietary stuff, but so that's what they concluded, right? That squirting was not even the squirt, the gushing squirt was not even diluted pee. It was basically pee. I don't think they checked. I don't think they checked fructose and glucose. I'm not 100% sure. They didn't say. They didn't say like after the squirt how long it had passed after, you know, until the second urine sample. There's another, it hasn't been published yet, but I spoke to a professor at Concordia who's been doing some MRI stuff, type research on other stuff, and it wasn't about ejaculation, but I asked him about that, and he was saying that you do see that. You have women, so what they do is they actually try to see what happens when you have sex in an MRI machine, and cool, right? And they say, you know, they always ask the women to pee before getting in the MRI, and they actually see almost immediately the bladder filling up once they start having sex. So you know, that would be consistent with this. So what is the gushing squirt made out of? I honestly don't think we have a good answer yet. Because we have these different studies finding different things. You know, we have different different chemical analyses of different women. You know, some of the previous studies were very, you know, they all presented individual data, and you go down the, you know, the 7 participants that they had, and you look at their levels of, you know, urea, for example, or PSA, and they are all very consistent. Like, all the squirt that came out was lower in urea and higher in PSA than the urine that these women provided. And now you have this study and that older one from 81 that, you know, found no differences. So, you know what? I don't know. I don't know, and I think that probably it differs. I think that there are probably some, you know, some women for whom it is, and depending on when it's voided, it's probably more pee than other times, and you know, some of them may have it mixed in with the milky substance from the prostate, and some may not. Some may only ejaculate that, and some may not. But yeah. So does it really matter is the question. Some people, it does matter. Mm-hmm. Hmm?
If you're both discerning, there's a big difference in taste. I mean, pee is horrible.
And that, how do you know? Right, of course it was a friend told you. I know. No, and it is true because a lot of the people, a lot of the women themselves who have this experience or partners of women who squirt, the gushing squirt, who have tasted it, right, say it really doesn't taste like it doesn't look like it, and all that. And, in many of those cases, a lot of these women who squirt on a regular basis, they try to pee right before, right? And so, if that happens, the chances are it's a lot more diluted pee than it would be otherwise. So that may be happening in many cases. So it is like there's special urine, like some of those women kind of thought they would be. Other thoughts or questions? So, how much does this really matter? And we can talk more about the experiences. I just want to go through a couple of more slides of what some of the women are saying about their experiences and try to answer some of those FAQs based on the very little data that we have available. So there are a couple of studies of those questionnaire studies that we already talked about that asked women, so how does this work for you? How does it make you feel? How does it affect your life? How does it affect your partners? And this more recent study of 320 squirters, international sample that these guys collected, basically of all of these ejaculators, they said 80% said that it enriched their lives. 10% said, I don't know how I feel about it. I'm sort of indifferent. Take it or leave it. 10% said, I sometimes wish I didn't squirt, or I kind of wish I didn't squirt. And then, 1% said, I really think it's a pathological kind of thing. So most of them thought of it as a positive, enriching life experience. Gilliland, when she was asking her 13 ejaculators to talk about that, a lot of them talked about how that makes them special, and how that makes them different, how that's brings something to the sexual act, to their sexual partners that other women may not. And this one girl actually was kind of saying, I'm not really that attractive and stuff, but I can do this awesome thing, and men love it. And I'm like, okay, yeah, good. And then they also asked them about partners' knowledge, and they said that 90% in reaction to this, and 90% of them said, their partners were positive about it or loved it. 5% were indifferent. 4% didn't know. And 1% said their partners were negative about that. And that kind of, goes back to some of the stuff that more in-depth questions that Jillian asked her 13 ejaculators, that the initial responses of women were often in two different types of responses. Some had all this like fear and shame and guilt and embarrassment and grossness around that, especially the ones who squirted young and were not very knowledgeable about what this thing is. And then it took them a while, reading and talking to people and educating themselves to get to a point of accepting it and then maybe, embracing it. And then the other group of initial reactions was like, oh my God, this is so cool. This is amazing. How can I do it again? Kind of thing. And how can I reproduce it and get all my partners, to be able to do this and stuff. And sort of that kind of more positive exploratory side, especially for the women who are a little older and more knowledgeable when it first happened. Okay, so can all women squirt? Can all women squirt? We don't know. That's one of the things that we really don't know. The only data that can speak to this in terms of published data is that study where they tried to get women to ejaculate, try to make these 27 women to ejaculate. They only got like 12 of them to do that, even after 4 sessions of an hour of this. Right.
What's your anecdotal experience?
Oh, he'll share a lot. One thing that the literature continuously, pretty much all the studies that I read, mentioned over and over again, was that it is not a common thing. That it doesn't happen to many women, and it certainly doesn't happen all the time, even to the ones who do have that experience at least once in their lives. So in that 320 international ejaculators sample, they said that 19% of them said that they ejaculated all the time, or almost all the time that they had an orgasm. So it was not like, some percentage of women do have that all the time, but most do not. There was another study in Egypt. How the fuck did you get women in Egypt to do this? Seriously, like now, 5 years ago, where they stimulated the clit with a vibrator of 38 healthy women, and then checked for expulsion of fluid at time of orgasm from the vagina and or the urethra, and didn't, none of the women had any kind of expulsions. And then, Masters and Johnson old study that they brought people into the lab, right, and they had either masturbatory completed cycles or coital completed cycles, and they only found a handful. They literally reported a handful of people that did this. Okay, does ejaculation always mean orgasm? Very, very little data on that in these studies. So the only 2 studies that had any kind of information on that was in that 13 ejaculator sample of Jillian, where 2 out of the 13, so 15%, reported that ejaculation and orgasm were independent events for them. That ejaculation could happen at any point in time, and that it was often not part of orgasm. That it could be part of orgasm, but it was not always a part of orgasm. And in the study where they were trying to get women to squirt, 3 out of the 10 that they managed to squirt said that they didn't experience orgasm with that experience. That fluid just came out, but they didn't actually have the subjective experience of an orgasm. And from anecdotal experience, and Kenneth will share that, a lot of women do say that it may or may not be an orgasm, because orgasm is partly a subjective experience of, are you coming? And there's also often objective measures of orgasm, which are not present in all women all the time, but anal sphincter contractions is pretty consistent when you're coming, and that goes for all sexes. All bodies have anuses, so when you come, your anus contracts. And some of the pretty consistent kind of robust ways of measuring orgasm in the lab is that if you can get people to put anal probes in their asses, which again a lot of people don't want to do. So yeah. Is an ejaculatory orgasm better? No idea. The only study that had anything to say about this was this study that had 2 people, one of the biochemical analyses studies that had 2 people, and in both of them said yes, when I squirt and come is more intense than when I don't squirt, but that's just 2 women. No other data available whatsoever. I'm almost done. What I want to address, because we've kind of avoided a lot of this up to this point, but where's the G-spot in all of this? And because the search for female ejaculation is very closely intertwined with the search for the G-spot, which we still don't know if it really exists, and how, if it does, what exactly it is. And so let me just address that with some of the research, and then we can go to some of the more fun, practical, how-to and anecdotal shit. So the G-spot is supposed to be this highly sensitive area in the interior front wall of the vagina that swells up upon stimulation. And so, here it's, kind of two knuckles in, up towards the front of the body. A couple of the studies that have asked large groups of women if they think they have it, about 50 to 60% say that they think they have a particularly sensitive area around that part of their vaginas. And a number of these studies, and some of the same studies that did the ejaculation stuff, also what they had before they had the women squirt so that they can test the biochemical analyses, what they had was gynecologists examine their, do a pelvic exam and kind of touch everywhere a little bit and stimulate everywhere. So, 1 o'clock, 2 o'clock, all the way. And, yeah, and they asked both the gynecologist whether they would notice, certain areas swelling more than other areas, and they would also ask the participant whether they were feeling something different when different areas were being stimulated. And in many of these studies, both the gynecologist and the participant, the vast majority of them would report that there is a sensitive area around the 12 o'clock, right there, or between 11 and 1 o'clock. It's a particularly sensitive area, and the gynecologist would concur that there would be this area where after a little bit of stimulation, right, in that section would get more swollen and kind of, change a little bit in the consistency of it, in the texture, yeah. So from these kinds of studies, it seems like there is something there. And, what's the G-spot's role in the ejaculation? Well, as you saw, it does seem to lead to ejaculation when stimulated in a particular way, at least in some women, right? A number of women in these studies said that that's pretty much the only way or the main way, or, it requires that is being stimulated in order for them to ejaculate. But also is not linked to ejaculation in some other women, like all those women who said that it's the clitoral orgasm that gets them to expel the fluid. So in some women, it seems to play a role in this. And where that's pushing, right, it's that clitoral urethral vaginal complex, CUV, right? So it's pushing right where it's the internal portion of the clitoris that goes right around the urethra and the vagina, and the urethra is right there. So when you push up, you're pushing up the anterior wall of the vagina, you're pushing up the urethra, and you're pushing up all the erectile tissue that the internal clitoris, not all of it, but the vestibular bulbs that the clitoris is made up of. And what exactly it is, so that's the big debate. So it seems like most people, not everybody, there's still this crazy Italian scientist, or I don't even know if he's a scientist, he doesn't seem to have done any research on it, but every time, With his daughter? Oh. His name's Pupo. But every time somebody publishes a study saying, we found evidence that the G-spot exists, he writes a response, that does not exist. And he provides zero evidence for it. He just says, that does not exist. It's like a response to the editor, a letter to the editor saying, no, it's a myth. I'm like, how about producing some evidence? So currently, just the status of what exactly the G-spot may be, it could be, so some people are thinking, because some of the histological evidence, when you dissect people and then look for something that's, different from the surrounding tissue is somewhat inconclusive, and then MRI studies have also been done, and they're somewhat inconclusive. So some people are saying it could be the Skene's glands, it could be the female prostate, because that's where it is, or if it exists, that's where it should be located. So the interior wall of the vagina does have more nerve endings than the posterior, the proximal part of the vagina, but is that just the vagina being more innervated, or is it its own entity, anatomical entity? Some are saying it just could be a functional area, not an anatomical area. It's the functional area, it's the fact that you're pushing up against this highly innervated portion of the vagina, plus the urethra, plus the clitoris, the internal portion of the clitoris. And so what effectively you have is not a separate anatomical entity, but just like a functional area, which when you push against, something happens and feels good and better, because you're pushing on three things that could potentially feel good and better. And then there's some brand new evidence coming out in the last 2 years, both histological and MRI, that are claiming, so the histological studies, they dissected like 11 fresh cadavers and claimed that they found in every single one of them an area that was unique and separate and different from the rest. And it was described as, I will never remember this, but it was described as the G-spot was intimately fused with vessels, creating a complex. A large, tangled, vein-like vascular structure resembled an arteria venous malformation, and there were a few smaller feeding arteries. A band-like structure protruded from the tail of the G-spot. The size varied. Histologically, it was determined as a neurovascular complex structure. Neural component contained abundant peripheral nerve bundles and a nerve ganglion. The vascular component comprised large vein-like vessels and smaller feeding arteries. Circular and longitudinal muscles covered it. I'm not an anatomist, so I don't know. I can't quite make too much sense of all that. Maybe some people with more biological knowledge would. But so that just came out like last year, and then another MRI study saying that they found some evidence of there being in live women something distinct, and not in all of them, but in like 60% of their 20+ women that they looked at, they found something unique. So who knows, again, if that's an anatomically owned entity or if it's a functional area, or we're talking about the skin's glands, basically, or in different women it could be potentially different things, who knows. It's way too detailed. No one has gotten, I mean, that's a great question, but we're still trying to answer the more basic stuff. So not there yet, not there yet. Okay, that's all. That's all I had to say. If anyone is crazy about delving into the actual studies themselves, I have included the references of that review study in pretty much, pretty much everything that has been published up until that point. And, we'll share this with all of you so you can go and find the studies and delve into them to your heart's content. Any last burning questions before Kenneth takes over and I shut up? Because I'm kind of looking forward to shutting up. You're welcome.